Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I am the host, Noel Armstrong. Thank you, as always, for listening. This is the only podcast where knowledge is the treasure, and the treasure is knowledge. Yes, that's right. And today we're going to begin a series on mysterious deaths. Mysterious, that is, only to researchers who have studied them thus far. We are going to weigh in with an opinion. We are going to, with shocking hubris, decide exactly how some famous historical figures died. And we're going to begin with one of the most famous historical figures in the world, King Tut. King Tut is probably, currently, the most famous pharaoh in history. Not because he was particularly consequential. In fact, his deeds were not epic. His life was not momentous. He left no powerful descendants, and even his tomb was humble and kind of slapdash by Egyptian standards. And yet, if you conduct a simple non-scientific poll and ask people to name one pharaoh or one king of ancient Egypt, King Tut will be by far the name they cite the most often. His Osiris mask, weighing 22.5 pounds of pure gold, is one of the most instantly recognizable and famous pieces of art in the entire world. And the legend of the mummy's curse that the excavation of King Tut's tomb gave rise to has made its way into novels and stories and movies and TV shows ever since. It's entered the common cultural parlance. There's no doubt that King Tut is very well known. But what is much less well known, and is in fact a mystery to this very day, is how King Tut died. And that's what we're going to talk about today on the History of Being Human podcast. The mysterious death of a boy of only 19 years of age. That's how old King Tut was estimated to be at the time of his death. 19-year-olds don't die of what is called natural causes, or of old age. Even in ancient times, especially someone as privileged and wealthy and well-fed as King Tut would have been. And so today, on our first episode of our epic series of mysterious deaths of historical figures, we're going to dive into what exactly killed King Tut. Before we can talk about what killed him, let's orient King Tut to his time and place. We know him as Tutankhamen, but nobody during his lifetime would have called him that. The reason for that is that Egyptian kings actually had 5 names, and it's the last 2 names that were the most important. These last 2 names were the names that would have been inscribed on monuments and tombs. It's common for us to refer to the Egyptian pharaohs by their nomen. That is the last of the 5 names. But when ancient Egyptians referred to their rulers, they would have used the prenomen. And in this case, King Tut's last 2 names were Nebkheperure Tutankhamen. And his courtiers and subjects would have called him Nebkheperure much more often than Tutankhamen. But don't worry, we're not going to try to reinvent the wheel and call him King Neb from now on. He's going to be King Tut because we now refer to the ancient pharaohs by their nomen, their last of 5 names. And in this case, that would be Tutankhamen. And that name, Tutankhamen, has a history of its own. It's not the name he was born with. It's a name that he assumed when he came to power. But to understand that, we have to understand what was going on in Egypt around the time King Tut was born. In fact, we have to go back even farther, to the beginnings of the 18th dynasty, the New Kingdom in Egypt. Egypt has a mind-boggling long history. Over 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. Historians divide that 3,000 plus years of history into 3 kingdoms. Think of the kingdoms as 3 golden ages. Ages of central rule, massive architecture and building projects, population booms, relative stability politically. These kingdoms are called the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. At the end of each of these kingdoms is what's called an intermediate period. These are times of relatively less central rule, less political stability, fewer monumental building projects, more conflicts, so relatively weak and divided periods. The time into which King Tut, Tutankhamen, was born is called the New Kingdom Egypt. It's also called the Egyptian Empire because never had Egypt been so wealthy, powerful, never had its boundaries extended so far. And the New Kingdom period didn't begin very auspiciously. In fact, just before the New Kingdom, or the Egyptian Empire time as we now call it, there was a period called the Second Intermediate Period. During this second intermediate period, all of Lower Egypt came under the dominion of foreign rulers, a people that were known as the Hyksos, Hyksos, Hyksos. Well, at least that's what we call them. Hyksos is just the Greek version of the Egyptian term Heka Kasut, which meant rulers from foreign lands. These were rulers who came into Egypt or were already an immigrant community within Egypt and took over Lower Egypt. Wherever these Hyksos came from, the native Egyptian dynasties considered them foreigners, considered them invaders. And it wasn't until the end of the second intermediate period, the beginning of New Kingdom Egypt, that the Hyksos were driven from power. The way that happened is that a local chieftain living in Thebes, so these were Thebans living in Thebes, a man named Sekenenre, began to campaign against the Hyksos rule. He was very successful, but he died in battle. In fact, the mummy of Sekenenre is unique because you can still see 5 deep head wounds in this mummy that undoubtedly led to his death, probably inflicted on Sekenenre by the Hyksos he was fighting. Sekenenre's son Kamos continued the battle against the Hyksos, and it was Kamos' son Ahmose I who finally succeeded in completing the expulsion of the Hyksos and uniting all of Upper and Lower Egypt in what became known as New Kingdom Egypt. So he's the first pharaoh of New Kingdom Egypt. Then Ahmose and each pharaoh that followed him would extend Egypt's borders further for quite a while. In fact, Ahmose himself went and campaigned in the Levant, the region where the Hyksos are said to have come from. He campaigned in the Levant and subjected the Canaanite cities there to prevent another incursion by the Hyksos. His son Amenhotep I campaigned in the other direction. He went south and brought Nubia under Egyptian control. Amenhotep's son Thutmose I campaigned all the way into Syria and was the first Egyptian ruler ever to cross the Euphrates River on his campaigns. So this was a period of time, and this was a dynasty engaged in expanding the borders and influence and wealth of Egypt. And this dynasty, the 18th dynasty, that began with the grandson of Sekenenre, continued to produce some brilliant military and political leaders. In fact, some of the best-known pharaohs in history came from that 18th dynasty. After Ahmose and Amenhotep and Thutmose, one of the most interesting pharaohs in Egyptian history would come to rule. And that's the famous female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history. And by all accounts, her reign was very successful, very productive. Never mind the fact that her stepson, Thutmose III, tried to erase her memory from history, had her name and image scrubbed from every monument and every mural he could find. Somehow her memory survived that. But Thutmose III resented the rule of his stepmother. It's very clear by the way he tried to wipe her out from history. And Thutmose III himself, aside from being a spiteful little jerk, would become one of the most successful pharaohs in the history of Egypt. He's considered a military genius by historians of war. In something like 20 years, he conducted at least 16 various campaigns. He's recorded to have captured 350 cities during his rule and conquered much of the Near East, all the way from the Euphrates River to Nubia. So Egypt and the 18th dynasty prospered during all of those reigns. After Thutmose III came Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and then Egypt reached its height of wealth and influence and splendor during the reign of Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III was probably the wealthiest pharaoh in the history of Egypt. He's the one who built the Luxor Temple, his own massive mortuary temple, and the Malkara Palace, the largest palace in Egypt. He also had an entire lake built for his great royal wife Tayi. And even though he was wealthy enough to maintain a vast military power, he had a much more sensible way of dealing with his former enemies. That is, he would simply send them letters, and he would send them gold, gifts. That might sound like an expensive way to placate Babylon and Assyria, but it's a lot less costly than the losses an army can incur. Now I realize I'm going on for a while about this New Kingdom dynasty, the 18th dynasty of pharaohs. The key to remember, though, is a very powerful and successful and long-lasting line of pharaohs came from the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes. All of those that I have mentioned, from Sekenenre all the way down to Amenhotep III, considered themselves Thebans. Ancient Egyptians were polytheistic. They had many, many gods. But the patron god of the city of Thebes was Amun, the god of the air. And many of the 18th dynasty pharaohs attributed their success in battle and in ruling to the god Amun. Because of this, the priests of Amun at Thebes became very politically powerful. Hatshepsut in particular was devoted to the god Amun, and so the priests of Amun became almost royal figures at that time. But this would all change after the death of the great and wealthy Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III's son, of course his name was Amenhotep IV, would become known as the heretic pharaoh, one of the best-known 18th dynasty pharaohs, the heretic pharaoh, because shortly after he took power, he would change Egyptian worship. He would abandon the god of the air, Amun, in favor of the god of the sun, the disk of the sun, the Aten. He would change his name from Amenhotep IV, meaning the god Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. Akhenaten was personally very devoted to the god Aten. He seems to have been somewhat of a religious zealot. In fact, he forbade the worship of all other gods in the Egyptian pantheon. He might have gone so far as to say there is only one God. So many historians consider him the first true monotheist. But even if he wasn't truly monotheistic, he was certainly henotheistic. He certainly elevated the worship of Aten above all other gods. He and his wife Nefertiti, his great royal wife, would perform rituals to the god Aten, something that had formerly been the purview of priests. He stripped all of the priests of Amun of their power. He rededicated their temples to the god Aten, and he moved the capital of ancient Egypt to the city of Amarna. You can imagine how popular that made him with the formerly very powerful priests of Amun. No one knows exactly what triggered this religious transformation, his conversion to the god Aten, but he and his wife Nefertiti were truly devout. In fact, he wrote the great hymn to the Aten, and it still survives to this day. It's considered the inspiration for Psalms 104 by many historians. The city where he moved his royal palaces and residence, I've called Amarna because that's what we call it now. But to the ancient Egyptian, to Akhenaten, it was Akhetaten, which meant horizon of the Aten. This pharaoh, Akhenaten, was all in for the disk of the sun, to the point that he actually forbade and punished severely the worship of any god except Aten. Historians who are somewhat sympathetic to him describe him as enigmatic, mysterious, revolutionary, the greatest idealist in the world. Those who are a little less sympathetic to him call him a heretic, fanatic, possibly insane and mad. You can imagine, though, when you're pharaoh, people have to do what you say. But people don't like being told which god they have to worship. In fact, many of them were quite devoted to Thoth, or to Amun, or to Ra, and didn't like being told that there was no other god in all of the cosmos except Aten. So resentment stirred among his subjects, and he also ignored some of the weightier matters of statesmanship, such as diplomacy. He spent all of his time and money constructing monuments and devoting worship to the disk of the sun. He didn't maintain the traditions of gift-giving and letter-writing to other nations that his father and others had maintained. So Egypt became a much more insulated and isolated nation under the reign of the heretic pharaoh. Now, I will say that the one redeeming feature of Akhenaten's reign is the art that he patronized. Fantastic images came out of that time, the Amarna period, during the reign of Akhenaten. There's much more that could be said about this heretic pharaoh. But for our purposes here today, what concerns us the most is that before he died, he sired a son and named him Tutankhamen, the living image of the Aten. Now, you as an astute listener might be thinking, that sounds an awful lot like the name of King Tut, Tutankhamun. Well, you wouldn't expect the heretic pharaoh to give birth to a son and name him the living image of the god Amun. No, he named him Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten. That's the name that King Tut was given on his birth. King Tut's father was that heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten. That's not really in dispute. His mother's identity is less certain. For a long time, people assumed that Nefertiti, one of the most striking women in antiquity, was his mother. And there may have been some advantage to King Tut in claiming the great royal wife Nefertiti as his mother. But recent DNA analysis has ruled out Nefertiti as the mother of King Tut. In fact, the mother of King Tut, we don't know the name of. She's called only the Younger Lady. That's the informal name given to a mummy that was discovered in the Valley of the Kings by the archaeologist Victor Lorad in 1896. This Younger Lady, this young female mummy, it turns out on DNA analysis, was the mother of King Tut. And even if we don't know what her name was, we know who she was. Let me put it this way. You and pretty much everyone else you know probably have 4 grandparents. 2 on your father's side, 2 on your mother's side. Well, King Tut was not blessed with 4 grandparents. He had exactly 2 grandparents. That's because younger lady, who has been proven by DNA analysis to be the mother of King Tut, was the full sister of Akhenaten, his father. Yes, that's right. King Tut's parents were brother and sister, making his mother and father his aunt and uncle, I guess. So he's the product of some serious inbreeding. Now that may sound strange to us. That may offend our sensibilities. It wasn't altogether unheard of in ancient Egyptian circles. In fact, if you think all pharaohs are divine, why wouldn't you, as a divine pharaoh, marry another member of that divine family? Why marry a common mortal? Now, since this episode is ostensibly about the death of King Tut, that becomes important. King Tut was the product of inbreeding, and he was subject to some of the genetic challenges, the health challenges, that can be associated when your mother and father are so genetically closely related. I mean, let's face it, genetic diversity is generally a very good thing. If you come from the Tutmos dynasty like King Tut did, and if your fathers have cleft palates, huge incisors, large overbites, narrow shoulders, rounded waist, large hips, and flat feet, the odds are pretty high that if your father marries your sister, you're going to get many of those traits. And such was the case with King Tut. Antinous he was not. He was not a very imposing or impressive physical specimen. 5 feet 6 inches tall, very slight of build. He had large front teeth, front incisors were quite large, and he had a large overbite, like most of the Tutmos dynasty. He also shared a partially closed cleft palate, a cleft hard palate with some other members of the Tutmos dynasty, which might have affected the way that he communicated. When archaeologists analyzed the clothing found in his tomb, especially the loincloths and belt, they found that King Tut had a narrow waist and large rounded hips. More important is the fact that he seemed to have had a mild scoliosis, so he could have had some physical back pain, and it may have been either the result or the cause of asymmetry between his limbs. In fact, his left foot was a clubfoot. 2 of the bones in that foot showed evidence of necrosis, meaning bone death, loss of blood supply leading to bone death. His right foot was very flat, which might be why archaeologists found over 130 walking sticks in his tomb. Tutankhamen must have walked with a cane, and that despite being only 19 years old at the time of his death. Another interesting find is that the sandals he wore seemed specially designed to support his mismatched feet. He might have been the first person in history that we know of to wear orthopedic shoes. So with the help of forensic medicine, scientists tried to explain his unusual, let's say less than hale and hearty physical health. Possibly they thought it came from Marfan's disease, gynecomastia, Klinefelter's syndrome. Klinefelter's is where you have 2X and 1Y chromosomes instead of 1X and 1Y chromosome. So Klinefelter's might have caused some of the physical changes that they found to be present in King Tut. And I guess I should explain that Marfan's is an inherited disorder of connective tissue. Your connective tissue that anchors your organs together is weakened. And not only does it change your physical appearance, causing you to look long and slender with long arms and legs, problems with your palate, it can weaken your aorta. It's possible if King Tut had that, he could have died of an aortic aneurysm. Now, luckily, we have more information on those topics, because in 2010, a group that had worked on the DNA analysis of various mummies for over 3 years in Cairo published their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. They found that Tutankhamen, King Tut, had no evidence of any of these genetic disorders. No Marfan's, no Klinefelter's, no gynecomastia of a genetic type, no androgen insensitivities, etc. But what they did find in Tutankhamen and several of his close family members' mummies was the presence of genes specific to Plasmodium. In short, King Tut had several different strains of malaria, including the most severe strain, Malaria tropica. He must have been reinfected several times throughout his life. And I want to take a brief pause from the physical condition of the mummy and DNA analysis to talk a little bit about that life. What do we know about the life of Tutankhamen? We can tell several things about his physical health simply from his remains. First, he died at age 19. He was also somewhat compromised by various ailments. So with that in mind, of course, we would not expect military campaigns along the order of Thutmose III, or building projects such as Amenhotep III. we would expect him to have a more modest set of accomplishments, and that indeed seems to be the case. The main thing that King Tut set out to do was to reverse some of the more negative effects of his father the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, to reverse some of the negative effects of his legacy. And I haven't emphasized enough how turbulent the time was before King Tut came to power, how turbulent the reign of his father, the heretic pharaoh, had been. Under King Tut's father, worship of the solar disk alone was tolerated. All other gods were banned. Traditional clergy was suppressed and persecuted. A new zealous militant clergy, more akin to the Taliban than to the Quakers, took power. They savagely attacked all of the prominent temples, ransacked private tombs, erased all mention of any gods besides Aten in these tombs, erased them from personal prayers, names, depictions. Even his own father, the heretic pharaoh, scrubbed out the name of his own father, and Amenhotep became blank Hotep, because the heretic pharaoh wouldn't tolerate the mention of any other gods besides Aten. So really the Taliban is a fitting analogy to the reign of the heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten. And you know how well Afghanistan has prospered under the reign of the Taliban. That's how well Egypt did under the reign of Akhenaten, King Tut's father. And Egypt faltered politically, economically, and socially during that time. And so King Tut, whether it was he himself, whether he came up with the idea or he received counsel from some others who were wise and older than him, he set about to reverse some of the changes his father had instituted. It is said that he abandoned the Aten. He took counsel with the god Amun. Remember, that is the god of his ancestors, the patron god of the city of Thebes, the air god. King Tut made several endowments and restored the priests of Amun to their former position. Where his father had torn down their statues and temples, he set about building up new statues and new temples to the various gods. And he didn't just restore the priests of Amun. He restored all of the attending dancers, singers, and attendants to their positions, and he issued a decree of royal protection so that they would be secure in their positions for generations to come. In the second year of his reign, he actually changed his name. Remember, I told you he was born Tutankhamen. He changed his name to Tutankhamun. He married a woman named Ankhesenpa Aten, and had her also change her name to Ankhesun Amun. So his great royal wife was Ankhesun Amun. That's also an interesting story. Ankhesun Amun, King Tut's royal wife, was also his half-sister. The heretic pharaoh Akhenaten was the father of both of them. Both King Tut and his wife, they simply had different mothers. I'll just pause here to point out that Ankhesun Amun, King Tut's wife, had a life that was far more complex and interesting than King Tut himself did. For one thing, King Tut was not her first husband. Not only was the pharaoh Akhenaten Ankhesun Amun's father, he was also her first husband. It appears that she was married for a time to her own father before she married King Tut. And it was only after Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, died that she married King Tut. So we don't always know the exact nature of these marriages. They could have been mere formality, court formalities. They could have been to preserve the royal bloodline. But again, they're shocking to our modern sensibilities. Ankhesun Amun was married first to her own father, then to her half-brother, and then after her half-brother King Tut died, she lived on long after him. She was actually pressured into marrying the Grand Vizier to legitimize his claim to the Egyptian throne. But during Tutankhamen's lifetime, she was his great royal wife. And it's apparent from his tomb, from King Tut's tomb, that they had two daughters. One of the daughters appears to have died at 5 months in utero. The other appears to have died at birth. And as I said, their mummies were found in King Tut's tomb. So obviously some sadness in that family over the loss of two daughters, and over the fact that King Tut, Tutankhamen, and Ankhesun Amun produced no royal heirs. After changing his name and his wife's name to reflect their new religious sensibilities, they also decided to move the Egyptian capital back to Thebes. So Akhenaten moved the capital to Amarna to build a new center of worship for the Aten. And King Tut and his wife moved the royal capital back to Thebes, where their ancestors had hailed from. His father must have been turning over in his grave, because not only did King Tut move the royal capital back to Thebes, he exhumed the body of his father, Akhenaten, and moved it back to Thebes. So his father had gone to all the trouble of building a new capital city in Amarna and being buried there, and King Tut reversed that. He took his father's mummy back to Thebes and had it reburied in the Valley of the Kings. This actually helped strengthen King Tut's reign. It endeared him to his people. He also had other work to do. He had to restore the diplomatic ties that had been severed under his father's reign. So King Tut began to reach out with letters and gifts to the various kingdoms. He began with the Mitanni people, a powerful kingdom to his north. And we know that he had some success, because letters and gifts, once again, are evidenced at the time of King Tut, that had been absent during the reign of Akhenaten. From all this, I would say that the reign of King Tut was off to a very good start, a very auspicious beginning. Diplomatic ties were being restored, temples were being rebuilt, peoples who had been persecuted because of the zealotry and bigotry of his father were being restored. So most of the population of Egypt would have been very happy with King Tut's reign so far. There's one group, though, that obviously would have been very dissatisfied. That would be the priests of Aten. The priests who had held so much power under King Tut's father now found themselves out of power. They could no longer persecute whomever they wished, couldn't put people to death, couldn't tear down temples, couldn't scratch names off of tombs, and so forth. So the militant priests of Aten must have been very dissatisfied with the reign of King Tut. We'll come back to that. What else do we know about the life of King Tut? We know from his mortuary temple that he was involved in a couple of minor skirmishes with both the Nubians and some Asiatics. Because of his physical disabilities, it's unlikely that he himself participated in those battles. But because pharaohs were also supposed to be the war leaders of their people, he is depicted as taking part. There are scenes of him riding in chariots, particularly hunting ostriches. It seems that King Tut, for reasons that completely escape me, loved to go hunting ostriches. He was buried with an ostrich fan. The feathers had deteriorated, but on the handle of the fan, which remained in his tomb, there are depictions of King Tut leaving to go on an ostrich hunt, and then on the other side, King Tut returning, successfully having killed an ostrich. So he would have had to know how to ride a chariot and shoot a bow. Beyond this, we don't know much about the life of King Tut. It's hard to get a much more detailed profile if we're trying to figure out what caused his death or why he died than what I've mentioned above. There's no evidence that he was a great risk taker, but he did participate in ostrich hunts on a chariot shooting bows. That in itself is inherently dangerous. I would say he was liked and appreciated by the great majority of the Egyptian population. The one exception to that, the one group that might have wanted him dead, would have been those that his father had elevated, the priests of Aten and their associates. So it is possible that King Tut made some very powerful enemies there. We also know from DNA analysis that he was carrying several strains of malaria. So, of course, we could blame his death on malaria, as I pointed out in a previous episode. There have been roughly 100 billion human beings on Earth in its entire history, and maybe 50 billion of those human beings were killed by malaria. And so it's certainly not exceptional or out of the realm of possibility that King Tut died of malaria. But let's look into the condition of his tomb and the exhumation of his mummy for more clues before we reach a final conclusion about what killed him. And first of all, let me say this. In King Tut's tomb, and frankly out of it for that matter, there is no writing and no description, no indication of what caused his untimely death. And yet the tomb itself does offer some clues. When Howard Carter discovered the tomb of King Tut in 1922 in the Valley of the Kings, he found that it had been mostly undisturbed, possibly disturbed once or twice immediately after King Tut was buried. But then for 3,200 years, it had not been disturbed. It was perfectly well preserved. So King Tut died in around 1323 BCE. There was evidence that somebody had entered the tomb very early after that time. But then all the way up to 1922, that tomb was not disturbed. All of the valuable artifacts had not been stolen. For a tomb full of such treasures not to be looted is very uncommon. And the reason that King Tut's tomb had not been looted is because first, no one would have thought to look for a pharaoh's tomb where this was found. Normally a pharaoh's tomb would be carved into the slopes of the Valley of the Kings. This tomb was in the valley floor. And the second reason is, this tomb was much smaller than you would have expected a pharaoh to be buried in. Because of these two factors, archaeologists believe to this very day that King Tut was buried in a repurposed burial chamber. And what that tells you is his death was unexpected. Nobody knew that he was going to die at the age of 19 because they had not taken the time to build him a proper Pharaoh's tomb. He was buried in a repurposed burial chamber, smaller and in a different location than other pharaohs. Secondly, some findings on the mummy of King Tut itself offered some clues into possible ways he died. In 1968, researchers took x-rays of King Tut's mummy. They found that he had a depressed skull fracture, 2 intracranial bone fragments, so fragments of bone inside the skull, and evidence of a posterior subdural hematoma, bleeding inside the skull in other words, and that there were also fractures of his cervical spine. To the lead investigator taking those x-rays, that suggested that King Tut had been murdered, that he had sustained a blow to his head that was so powerful it crushed his skull and broke his neck. That could have occurred either in battle or because of some palace intrigues. So for a while, death in battle or murder were the leading causes suspected in the death of King Tut. But a later review of the same radiographs by a group in the American Journal of Radiology said no, that's not the case. None of these injuries were sustained during the lifetime of King Tut. They are much more consistent with the way the mummification process was undertaken and also the way that his remains had been handled and treated after they were found. So why was there a cranial fracture? Well, one of the ways that the brain was extracted was through the cranial vault. That is consistent then with what they found in King Tut's mummy's x-rays. Why were there bone fragments inside the skull? That is probably due to the way the mummy was handled after it was found. The reason for that is, when a king or somebody who was going to be embalmed died, the brain would be extracted and resin poured through the nasal cavity into the skull. Any fragments of bone or fractures that had occurred before the king had died would have been resined into place when the resin was poured. These 2 fragments of bone that were found inside of his skull were not resined. In other words, they were broken off after the embalming process. I know this gets a little complicated, but in short form, the damage to the cranial vault could have occurred during the embalming process. The fragments of bone that were found inside the skull and the neck fractures did not have resin on them that you would expect them to have if he had sustained injuries before his death. So all of these things, all of these changes to his skull, his cranium, occurred after he was dead. That's the take-home message. He was not killed by a blow to the head. Sometime after the x-rays of the skull were taken, a CT was taken of the entire mummy. What the CT revealed was that there were broken ribs on the left side, a missing sternum, the bone in the anterior chest that connects the 2 sets of ribs on the right and left. The sternum was missing. His heart was missing. There was a left thigh fracture, impacted wisdom tooth, and a cleft palate. We've mentioned the cleft palate, but we have not mentioned the impacted wisdom tooth, the left thigh fracture, and the broken ribs on the left side, missing sternum, missing heart. This pattern of injuries suggested to researchers that he possibly died in a chariot accident. It's possible that his left side was crushed by being run over by a chariot. Now, this hypothesis received quite a bit of attention also because we know that King Tut did ride in chariots, as we have mentioned the fact that he would bow hunt ostriches from a chariot. And certainly if you were run over by a chariot, you could crush your ribs, your sternum, and your femur. So it's all consistent. So that idea garnered some attention for quite a while. King Tut died being run over by a chariot in a terrible accident. And while that theory was plausible for a time, it has also been debunked, because later researchers went through the photographs of the mummy of King Tut from all the way back at the time that Carter excavated the tomb. Those original photographs from the time that the tomb was excavated showed that King Tut's chest wall was intact. The broken ribs and the damage sustained to the chest wall must have occurred during the manipulations and movements of the mummy after the tomb was discovered. They also showed that King Tut's mummy had been wearing a very valuable beaded collar at the time it was discovered. That beaded collar was removed at some point, and according to the photographs, it was lying right over the area where King Tut's mummy showed thoracic damage, where the ribs were broken, where the sternum was removed. So whoever removed the beaded collar probably unintentionally broke a few ribs and removed some other parts of the mummy along with it. So the fact that the chest wall was clearly intact at the time the mummy was discovered debunked the idea that he had died because his chest had been crushed in a chariot accident. Well, what about other diseases? I've already pointed out that King Tut had malaria. DNA analysis proves that. Well, the researchers who did this DNA analysis also looked for some other infectious causes of death and did not find them. So he was checked for bubonic plague, leprosy, tuberculosis, leishmaniasis. None of those things were found in his DNA. Now let's go back to a fracture that I didn't mention. I said that his chest wall probably was not crushed by a chariot accident. What about the femur fracture on the left side? Did that also occur when the body was moved? Well, here the case is totally different. The CT scan showed not only that one of the largest bones in his body, his left femur, had been fractured, had been broken, but it was actually a compound fracture. That means the bone protruded through the muscle and the skin of the thigh. This is a life-threatening injury in any age, right up to the present day. For one thing, you can throw a fat embolus. Fat from inside the femur bone can make its way into your bloodstream and clog up vital arteries. A fat embolus can kill you after such a serious fracture. The loss of blood, that could also kill you. A serious injury like this could set off a clotting pathway. One of the clots could easily break off and make its way to your lungs and heart and kill you. If you manage to live through the initial shock and blood loss and trauma of the injury, then you still have to deal with the very high probability that you would get an infection at the site of the fracture that would kill you, especially in an era where there are no antibiotics. If it could be shown that this fracture occurred while King Tut was still alive, we wouldn't be surprised if that's what killed him. In fact, we'd be shocked if he actually lived through it, especially considering his somewhat frail physical condition. Well, there are some clues that let us know when this fracture occurred. First, there was no evidence of bone healing. So this fracture either occurred very shortly before he died or sometime after he died. It couldn't have been weeks or months before King Tut died because there was no evidence of bone remodeling or healing. Another clue came from the embalming fluid, and this is the most important clue. The embalming fluid does not penetrate all the way down through the skin to the bones. So if embalming fluid could be found on the site of the femur fracture, on the bone itself, then there must have been an opening in King Tut's skin that allowed that embalming fluid to enter the skin and the flesh and make its way all the way down to the bone. Well, as it turned out, as they carefully analyzed the fracture site in the femur, they found that there was indeed embalming fluids and resins at the site. That means that when he was placed in the embalming fluid, when he was embalmed, King Tut had a compound fracture of the leg. So while this does not prove he was killed by a compound fracture of the femur, we do know that he sustained a compound fracture of the femur right around the time he died. So that leaves us with two candidates for the death of King Tut. One of them is this compound fracture of his femur. The other is the malaria that we've already mentioned. Let's talk just a little bit more about malaria. The most virulent type of malaria is caused by a parasite called Plasmodium falciparum. That is deposited in the bloodstream by a mosquito bite. Once it gets into your bloodstream, it goes straight for the liver. And this happens very quickly, before your immune system can even respond. Within a half an hour of you being bitten by a malarial mosquito, the parasite gets into one of your liver cells. There it divides into 40,000 structures called mesozoocytes. These mesozoocytes then rupture the liver cell, kill the liver cell, and enter the bloodstream. There, each of these 40,000 mesozoocytes can infect a red blood cell. Inside your red blood cells, this disease can hide from your immune system and multiply some more, break out of the red blood cells, and infect more red blood cells. This infection of your blood cells can cause anemia, fatigue, intermittent fevers, and in children especially, it can rapidly become fatal. Now, in populations that have been exposed to malaria for generations, and here I'm primarily talking about Africa because malaria is endemic in Africa, populations that have been exposed to malaria for many generations can develop some degree of resistance or immunity to this disease. If your red blood cells are not particularly hospitable to this parasite, then you don't suffer the worst effects of the disease. And this is where we come to sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is an inherited disease that results in an altered shape of your red blood cells. Those sickle-shaped cells do not transport oxygen very effectively, but here's the thing. The malaria parasite, the mesozoocytes, find it impossible to live in sickle-shaped red blood cells. So someone with sickle cell anemia can carry a very heavy load of Plasmodium parasites and live. So the question naturally arises, did King Tut have sickle cell anemia? We know, for example, that he had several strains of the malaria parasite, so he had been infected on multiple occasions. We also know that his great-grandparents had several strains of malaria, and they were much older. They'd lived into their 50s with these infections. So now we have another potential culprit in the death of King Tut. Remember I said that the DNA analysis that identified malaria in King Tut's mummy, and that Cairo group said that's what killed King Tut. Malaria must have been the cause of his death. Well, shortly after that article came out, German researchers published a rebuttal. They said, no, you're ignoring one thing that should be very obvious to anyone who treats tropical patients, and that is that King Tut probably had sickle cell anemia. That's what allowed him to carry such a heavy load of the malaria parasite. That's what also would explain the fact that a couple of his bones showed evidence of avascular necrosis. Bones that had been cut off from adequate circulation, so portions of the bone were dying. That can certainly happen during what's called a sickle cell crisis. And I have to say, after reading their letter to the editor, there is nothing wrong with their argument. It is perfectly sound, and it does explain some of the features of King Tut's DNA analysis. What it can't do, though, is prove that King Tut had sickle cell anemia. That would require more detailed DNA testing, and as of now, that has not been undertaken. Maybe in the future it will be. So, with all of this information, I am ready to summarize our findings. The first and most obvious finding is that King Tut did not lead a charmed existence. We know that he had some problems that made it very difficult for him to walk, and that, in fact, he probably had to use a cane to cover any distance. He had scoliosis, a left clubfoot, a right flatfoot, limb asymmetry, wore orthopedic sandals. We also know that he was infected multiple times with malaria, which could have led to exhaustion, recurrent fevers, melees. You just wouldn't feel well. And on the other hand, maybe he had sickle cell anemia that protected him from malaria. But if he did, he would be prone to very, very exquisitely painful bouts of what's called a sickle cell crisis. So that's no bargain either. He had an impacted third molar, so he had some very painful dental work to look forward to in his future. He fathered 2 daughters, neither of which lived past childbirth. So he was not immune from the sorrows and disappointments of life. And then sometime around his very untimely death, he suffered a catastrophic, very painful femur fracture, an open compound fracture. And in my opinion, that is the proximate cause of King Tut's death. That is what directly led to his untimely death. I think it's just too obvious. You have a very serious, life-threatening injury that happened so close to the time the king died that he had no time to even begin healing from it. Whether it was infection from the fracture, a blood clot, a fat embolus, simple shock and blood loss, I don't know. But I believe the femur fracture is what led to the death of King Tut. Now, he was weakened by these other factors before that ever occurred. Most of us have some comorbidities in our lives, but that's not what kills us. What killed King Tut was not the malaria, was not the sickle cell disease, and it doesn't appear that a blow to the head had anything to do with it. What killed him was that very serious, catastrophic femur fracture. Of course, what we don't know is, how did he break his leg? So the death is still very mysterious to me in some way. Now, I want to mention one more thing about King Tut. One more really sad fact about his existence. And this comes from what I consider a very effective write-up by Thea Baldrick in the April 2022 edition of the Collector magazine. Thea points out that King Tut's own father and family might have been ashamed of him. She says, quote, despite several depictions of the royal family at Amarna, of Nefertiti and her 6 daughters painted on the building stones during Akhenaten, King Tut's father's lifetime, Tutankhamen's likeness or representation with the family seems to be missing, end quote. So Thea points out here that there are several pictures of the family, but King Tut is in none of those pictures. The young Tutankhamen is missing. Why is that? Well, she has a theory. According to Thea Baldrick, it might be that the heretic Pharaoh was ashamed of his physically disabled son, so he refused to put his likeness on any of the family images. Writing about King Tut, she says this, and I will quote again, quote, "Perhaps he was beloved, but Akhenaten may have tried to present a veneer of perfection to his people and the rest of the ancient world in order to prove that he and his queen Nefertiti were the blessed conduits for the one true God, the Aten. The art hints at that. It shows a bounty of food, happiness, and light, when it is known that food must have been scarce, at least among the people. Perhaps his son and heir, who needed a cane to walk, who struggled with speech, who fell ill so often, was kept out of the limelight and off the painted walls for a reason. If that was the case, despite the grandeur of the burial goods, the remnants of mummified remains of the short-lived boy pharaoh buried with the tiny corpses of his attempt to continue the dynasty seem particularly poignant." End quote. I think that's beautifully written. So thank you, Thea Baldrick. I never thought about that until I read your article. And if it's true, if Akhenaten was ashamed of King Tut, if King Tut was raised feeling like he was never good enough to meet the standards of the Aten, that would explain why he reversed all of his father's religious reformations as soon as he came to power. This has been the History of Being Human podcast. Thank you once again for listening. Thank you to those of you who write me. If you want to write to me, contact me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word, all lowercase. thobhpodcast@gmail.com.